Journalists, politicians, Europhiles, Brexiteers are all girding their loins for developments at the end of next month, when a number of grace periods devised to prevent mayhem over the Northern Ireland Protocol are scheduled to expire. The EU and the UK disagree fundamentally, as I'm sure you all know, over their attitude to and interpretation of the protocol, a formula which, you'll remember, the two sides actually thrashed out together. The EU has been accused of being excessively purist, and the UK has been criticised for not adhering to what it signed up for. I find it astonishing that anybody would be accused of being excessively purist, which basically means sticking to exactly what you signed up for, but there you are. This is all, of course, food and drink to our guest for this In Conversation event, which is part of the Gasyard Féile programme. As Gareth said, his voice and his face became instantly recognisable to many of us as he beamed into our homes from various parts of the European Union, trying to make sense of Brexit and attempting to unravel the implications, the huge implications for the whole of this island and certainly for this part of the world. He was actually called twice as an expert witness to the House of Commons Committee for exiting the European Union, and I believe the only journalist, I think, isn't that right, Tony, to give evidence to it or testimony to it, is the author of this book, Brexit and Ireland, the Dangers, the Opportunities and the Inside Story of the Irish Response, which is published by Penguin Books, and there must be another book to come because it certainly hasn't ended at the last page of this book, I have to say, Tony.
That book will just get bigger.
Just keep going, right. Can I begin by maybe taking you back to, I was going to say the 23rd of June, 2016, when so many people voted in the Brexit referendum, but actually it was the early hours of the 24th, and what your memories of that are.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks to Gareth, and thanks as well for the dedication to Stephen. That's a very special gesture. Yeah, I mean, I'd been preparing for the referendum for a few weeks, and like most people on the run-up to it, I assumed that it would be a narrow victory for Remain, although in Brussels you would often meet people who had been to the UK for the weekend and come back and said, yeah, my sister's boyfriend is going to vote leave, and my cousin and his whole family is going to vote leave. So I was starting to get a little bit kind of wondering what way this was going to go. But the night of the vote in Brussels, there was a huge storm. I think there was a storm in the UK as well, but there was this really weird kind of thundery orange sky, so there was a real sense of foreboding. And a few people had gone to this Irish pub called the Funky Monkey, traditional Irish name, obviously, and to watch the results coming in. And I'd gone in for a brief visit and then gone home. And I was watching Newsnight for a bit, and then I went to bed, and Rika, my wife who's here, who's also a journalist, had to get up early to file, and she just shouted up at 5 a.m, "Honey, they're out!" And, so that was a real shock. And then just having to just jump up and try and make instant sense of what had happened and the implications of it. Just going on Morning Ireland, and then trying to get reaction from people in Brussels. And there was a meeting of a political group in the European Parliament. It's the ECR. It was the group that the Conservatives were in after they left the centre-right European People's Party, and they were having a kind of a post-referendum breakfast in a hotel. And everybody charged down there because they knew they'd get MEPs. This is like at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they'd get reaction, and people just couldn't believe what had happened. And at a certain point that day, I remember thinking, all of the implications that were suddenly going to tumble out like an avalanche of what Brexit would mean. And I suddenly had this horrendous kind of cold feeling that I could be working on this for years. Luckily, it was proved wrong, But that was my very vivid reaction at the time, and just trying to scramble to figure out what it meant and how to report it.
Well, that's an interesting point you make there, because what did you think it meant at that point? Because all we'd heard, or all we have heard, for years has been that Brexit means Brexit, but that is as expansive as it seems anybody on the Brexit side of the argument is prepared to be. What did you think it entailed?
Well, I remember, you know, like I would get up in the morning and listen to the Today programme on Radio 4, and as the campaign kind of reached its climax, you know, like the number of times I'd be throwing things at the radio because, you know, Brexiteers and cabinet ministers would be making claims about how the EU worked or about what Brexit would mean, and I was going, hang on a second, that's not right, or that's a very dubious claim to make. And I had done a lot of research into what leaving the EU would entail, like the sort of choices that Britain would be faced with, and the sacrifices they would have to make, and the kind of defensive position that the EU would take in you know, there was a fundamental feeling that if Britain leaves, it can't get a better deal than what it has now, because just other countries will want to leave as well. And I just thought, the more I read about what leaving meant, the more I thought they'd be mad to, you know, economically, from a geopolitical standpoint, from a lot of, you know, emotional, political, historical, you know, perspectives, it would be, you know, a kind of a nonsensical choice, you know, for a sovereign government. And then I thought, when these claims were being made, I thought, well, go ahead then, you know, leave, and then see what you're faced with. And in a sense, you know, that complete lack of coherence on the Brexit side as to what they wanted, what it would mean. You had so many cabinet ministers who had a complete misconception of what Brexit meant, or of what the EU would be prepared to countenance. That, you know, I just had a sense that this is going to be a huge mess, you know. But that, I mean, that was kind of an instinct that I think was borne out over time. But, you know, initially the British government didn't seem to know what they wanted. I mean, there were people who were saying the UK should trigger Article 16, not Article 16, what was it, Article 50,
Article 50
next week, or in 2 weeks' time. And in fact, you know, all of the opinion polling at the time in the first 6 months showed that the majority of British people wanted a soft Brexit. I mean, those who were in favour of Brexit, most of them wanted a soft Brexit where they would still have access to the single market. And but again, you know, I think in general, I think it's a fair assumption now that there was just a misunderstanding about how the EU worked among the people who drove Brexit, and that misunderstanding, I think, carried over into the negotiations and kind of flavoured the negotiations.
At what point did sort of your antennae start to, I don't know, whatever antennae do, become sensitive to the fact that there were going to be extremely serious implications for Ireland? It's interesting that you're talking about what you're thinking about, what it would mean for the UK and all that, but what about for Ireland?
I mean, the Irish issue was on the radar before the referendum itself, because the Irish government had identified it as a real danger. And of course, Enda Kenny and other government ministers had been pretty much campaigning in the UK for a Remain vote, you know, as far as protocol would allow.
Phil Hogan was over, he was, wasn't he?
Phil Hogan, I mean, Phil Hogan was the only commissioner who was given any license by the EU to go over and talk to farmers or talk at agriculture shows in the UK, because it was felt that the UK public would see him almost as one of their own. He had a good relationship with UK farmers as agriculture commissioner, and you know, he was a straight talker. Any other commissioner coming over, you know, you could have seen the headlines in the Daily Express, you know, interfering, overpaid, unaccountable bureaucrats telling us how to vote, etc. There was none of that at all with Phil Hogan. But I think, I mean, initially the Irish concerns were, yes, about Northern Ireland, but as much, if not more, about the trading relationship. If the UK left the single market and customs union, that could be devastating for trade between Ireland and the UK. I mean, the volumes aren't as high as they used to be, but they're still very significant, especially for farming. textiles, light engineering, and also the common travel area was a concern. I mean, the first meeting of Irish officials with UK officials after the vote, it took place about 4 days after the vote. There were officials from the Department of Justice in Dublin who met officials from the Home Office in the UK to try and work out how they'd keep the common travel area operating. Northern Ireland was obviously a danger, but it was, I mean, I remember speaking to an Irish diplomat at the time, just about 2 weeks after the result, and she said, you know, that there's going to have to be some kind of special status for Northern Ireland. But her initial kind of, these are the highlights, the headlines that we have to worry about, it was more about trade. And then when Enda Kenny met Theresa May in Downing Street, I think he was the first foreign leader to meet Theresa May when she became Prime Minister. I mean, officials who were at the meeting said, Theresa May said all the right things, no hard border, no return to the borders of the past, preserve the common travel area, preserve the peace process. And that was what the Irish government wanted to hear. But it was only when the British side were asked directly, well, how do you intend to avoid a hard border, that they didn't have an answer. And you could argue that they still don't really, they still haven't internalized what it means and how to avoid it.
There was a lot of talk at the time about technology. I mean, that was looming, and there were comparisons being made by the frontier between Switzerland and the EU, and between Norway and Sweden, the EU.
I mean, it's interesting to look back at what the Irish government were doing at the time. I mean, the negotiations got underway on the 17th of June, a year after the referendum. So it was nearly a full year after the referendum. And the Irish government was actually out going around Europe and looking at high-tech borders to see if that could be replicated just down the road on the Irish land border. I mean, people kind of forget that the Irish government did go down that particular rabbit hole for a while. And they were looking at Norway, and they were looking at Croatia and Serbia. They were looking at Poland and Ukraine, at Switzerland, as you say. And Norway was was seen as the most high-tech, low-friction border between a third country and the EU. Actually, I went to the border to do a story on it. And, you still had infrastructure, and you still had customs formalities, and trucks had to stop, but they timed it like you could do it all in 7 minutes. And the Norwegians had the right to go into Sweden up to 15 kilometers to check goods, and the Swedes had a reciprocal right. And the customs people on both sides were kind of mates, and would go out for dinner together. So there was a very kind of collegiate sort of relationship, one that you might not necessarily replicate on the island of Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, your account of it in your book, I mean, is quite extraordinary, because you're making the point that Norwegians would sort of do the work that had to be done on behalf of the Swedish.
Yeah, exactly,
or the EU, and vice versa. It's an extraordinary relationship.
But it's extraordinary to think back now that the Irish government was actually looking into that, and the head of the Revenue Commissioners was giving evidence to one of the Oireachtas committees, describing, okay, how do we minimize friction at the Irish land border? But at a certain point, and this was, I mean, people, especially in the UK press, they blame Leo Varadkar for coming along and changing everything. But this was all in Enda Kenny's time, and Enda Kenny, I mean, we were starting to hear this phrase, we can't let the technical get ahead of the political, So all the technical discussions and explorations that they were making, on the Norway-Sweden border or the Poland-Ukraine border, these were seen as, okay, technical fixes. And then at a certain point, it was almost overnight, Irish politicians were saying, we're not letting the technical get ahead of the political. And I remember ringing an official in Brussels and saying, what does that mean exactly? And they said, it's the North. In other words, what is a British problem, they're trying to make it an Irish problem. and basically we're kind of not having it. So they saw the problem of the Irish border as a political problem that had to be tackled in the negotiations. And what was kind of fueling that was that there was still a belief that Theresa May, despite what she was doing in her messaging to the Conservative Party base, and despite the fact that she was trying to prove her Brexiteer credentials, that she wanted to have a close trading relationship with the EU. And if she could be somehow persuaded to stay in the customs union and single market in some shape or form, then the Irish border could be resolved in that way. And it would almost be an incentive for her to go along that particular trajectory, keep the UK in a close trading relationship, a very soft Brexit. Therefore, that would minimize the friction at the Irish border. But the flip side of that was that it had to be done in the first stage of the negotiations, because if you left it to the trading negotiations, the UK could say, well, we'd love to have a close trading relationship with the EU, and if you don't give us, seamless access, that'd be terrible. What might happen to the land border on the island of Ireland? So you had this sort of very strong but somewhat subterranean tension between the two sides as to how they were going to approach this, and I think that tension is still there, obviously, to this day.
But go back up maybe a wee bit later in the process. Am I right in inferring that there was suspicion or concern among the other 26 EU nations that Ireland was sort of unduly close to the UK and maybe almost siding with the UK in the early stages of the negotiation?
Yeah, I think there was that concern. I mean, you often heard this expression that Ireland would be a Trojan horse, that the UK would be given some preferential access to the single market, having just left the EU, in order to suit the Irish concerns.
Yeah, assuage Irish concerns, yeah.
But, I mean, it was quite remarkable how quickly the EU decided to support Ireland in its national interests in avoiding a hard border and protecting, as they would see it, the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. And I think very early, I think even just a couple of months after the referendum, Angela Merkel raised the question of Northern Ireland at a G20 summit in Outer Mongolia, thousands and thousands of miles away from down the road. Angela Merkel was there. She'd identified it. But I mean, the Irish diplomatic service was out of the traps very quickly. And, the story is told of Enda Kenny meeting Angela Merkel shortly after the referendum and drawing a map of Ireland on an A4 piece of paper and putting X's where all the crossing points were on the border, the 200 crossing points, many of them just small roads. So, I mean, that was a remarkable achievement by the Irish government at the time to kind of educate the other member states to the nuances and subtleties of the peace process and what was at stake with Brexit. And we're still seeing a backlash by the UK against that. The fact that the EU's very overtly sided with Ireland in the understanding of what Brexit meant. And now, of course, we're hearing that the EU never took account of unionist concerns in that whole period. I mean, there's probably a bit of truth in that, but when it came down to it, the EU was always going to side with the member state that was staying behind and not leaving the EU. And there was a key moment before the negotiations started when Enda Kenny managed to get the European Council, which is the heads of government who meet 4 or 5 times a year in Brussels. They were adopting the negotiating guidelines to start the Brexit negotiations. So these guidelines are basically what gives Michel Barnier his mandate. And these are approved at the highest level. It's heads of government. So you've got 27 prime ministers saying, this is what we want you to achieve in the negotiations. And Enda Kenny had been lobbying for some kind of language that would recognise that if there was a united Ireland, Northern Ireland would be automatically part of the EU. And this was based on the German reunification model, because East Germany wouldn't have qualified for EU membership due to its poor social and economic conditions. But there was a deal done back in 1990, actually under the Irish presidency, where East Germany got spirited into the EU along with West Germany. And Enda Kenny was looking for something for Ireland if there was a united Ireland. And it wasn't put into the conclusions of the summit, but it was put in the minutes of the summit. So meaning it's actually a kind of legal commitment by the EU at the highest possible level to make sure that if there's a united Ireland, Northern Ireland will be part of the EU. And this was actually just around the time of the election that Theresa May had called. And Downing Street was lobbying furiously to stop that happening. Britain was still a member. And Downing Street was trying to prevent that from happening because they were worried that it would fuel the whole Scottish independence issue during a difficult election campaign. And the word went back to London that if Ireland wants this, they're getting it. And they're staying in the room and you guys are leaving. So to me, that was a very kind of graphic illustration of how the EU was always going to support Ireland as a member state in how this whole thing was going to be unravelled.
It's extraordinary, I mean, to hear about Angela Merkel mentioning the Irish question in Outer Mongolia. Yeah. I'm just wondering, you know, the great thing about having you here is that as RT's Europe editor, I mean, you have been right at the heart of all of the negotiation, all of the intrigue, you know, all of the diplomatic tussles that have been going on. I'm pretty sure you'll have contacts on both sides of the argument. Yeah. What is your impression of those who lobbied most fiercely for Brexit? Because there's a magnificent line in your book. A man, Dr. Edgar Morgan Roth, who said he studied at Keele University in the 1990s, and this quote: "I came across well-educated people there. They were clever, but had some strange views about the EU. You couldn't argue with them. They were not amenable to facts." That's an amazing line, you know. What was your impression of the most ardent Brexiteers?
Right. I have to be careful with my language here, obviously. A neutral observer, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Well, look, I mean, there's a whole sort of historiography of Britain's membership of the EU and what it meant, and you kind of it often boils down to a very simplistic notion that we only entered a trading bloc and then it became a political project. And certainly, you know, the funny thing is that it was always the Conservative Party that was more pro-Europe than the Labour Party in the 1950s and 60s. You know, Britain was falling behind economically, and the six founding members were, you know, having their, you know, in France they call it the 30 glorious years. You know, their economies were booming. So there was an economic rationale for Britain to join the EEC at the time, and eventually Britain got in. But then, I mean, things just kind of went sour under Margaret Thatcher. You had the Delors Commission, which, you know, in a nutshell, you had this move towards economic and monetary union at EU level, and that was kind of seen on the left, especially in France, as a bit of a capitalist, neoliberal project. So it had to be balanced by a much bigger social aspect of what the EU did, or the EEC at the time. So that was what Delors was pushing, was you know, like workers' rights, working time directive, all the social and health rights that were there to kind of counterbalance this move to an economic union or a monetary union. And that was what Thatcher railed against, because she was trying to roll back the state as the new conservative firebrand. And she famously said, you know, we're not going to let the EU push onto us what we have been rolling back as a Conservative government. So I think that sort of sowed the seeds of Conservative animosity towards the EU. And the Labour Party, like at the time in the early 80s, the Labour movement was extremely anti-EU, under Michael Foot. Yeah. So, you could see from various vantage points in the UK, there was a kind of an inbuilt hostility that was being generated. And then the tabloid press kind of jumped on the bandwagon. I mean, it's amazing to read some of the Daily Mail headlines from the 60s and 70s, extremely pro-EEC, and then today when you read how they approach it. So there are all these kind of forces that were kind of converging, and then you had the Maastricht Treaty, and that was seen as another big erosion of British sovereignty, and you had a sort of kind of a witch's brew of hardline British nationalists and sort of independence zealots who were always seen as a bit of a joke, and they were kind of cranks. But they gradually began to gain support and prominence, and you had the kind of relentless anti-EU messaging from the newspapers. And they, I think they are the ones who really started to condition the UK into having this kind of innate anti-EU sort of instinct. And then when push comes to shove, that gets inflamed, and then you have a Brexit movement. And just to sort of finish the point, at European elections, there was a kind of a sort of a cost-free vote for the UKIP party. It didn't really mean that much to bread and butter issues in the UK. You could vote for them, but then UKIP started to get prominence, and more people voted for them at European level. And that gives them prominence and profile. And so you have this perfect storm of Euroscepticism, and still it was only a narrow victory. That's one thing that I always come back to. It was 52 to 48. And that shows that there was still a huge groundswell of support for the EU. And that's still there. I mean, the polling hasn't changed very much. They talk about the 7 tribes of Brexit, from urban, well-educated people, university degree, younger, all supporting the EU, versus lower income, poorer education, and so on. So, I mean, that's just one way to understand it as a sort of a social political phenomenon.
I'm going to kind of bring you up to date, because we have this looming kind of, I'll use the word deadline about it. I don't know if it's entirely accurate word to use about it, but the fact that we have, come the end of September, we're going to be hitting kind of trouble again. And you wrote in your most recent blog on the RTE website, you pointed out helpfully that it's happening just right as we move into conference season across the water, which can be a tricky kind of time in the political calendar. Yeah.
So I think September and October are going to be very tricky months, because the grace periods that you mention cover the most acute elements of the protocol. So all of the food consignments, the mixed consignments that come into Northern Ireland supermarkets from GB. I mean, under the protocol, any food products of animal origin, so it's like meat or dairy, will need to have what's called an export health certificate. So it's coming from a third country, which is GB, into the single market, anywhere in the EU single market, or Switzerland, or Liechtenstein, or Norway, or Iceland. All of those goods would normally need to have this paperwork, and it's expensive and it's cumbersome. But the EU has been trying to develop, or get the UK to develop simplified versions of this. This was part of the deal last year with Michael Gove. Anyway, that was meant to be a 3-month deadline, grace period. Then the UK extended that unilaterally. And then the famous sausage deadline was going to be a 6-month. So that was agreed by both sides. So that's been extended to, again, the end of September. So the export health certificate and the sausage stuff, all happening at the end of September. The UK also unilaterally waived or extended the deadline for pets moving from GB to Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And there's a whole other bunch of stuff. And it's all going to come to a head at the end of September. So, in the meantime...
Will it come to a head, or is there a date? Not be kicking the can on down the road again, is that?
Well, the EU is like adamant that you can't just keep having rolling extensions. You know, that businesses and communities and stakeholders need, they need certainty, they need stability. You know, businesses have to adapt to the new reality. And once they adapt, you know, they'll get used to it, and things will be, you know, very challenging, but, you know, over time it'll bed down and it'll work with the flexibilities that they've been introducing. But the trouble is now that the UK has just kind of lobbed a grenade into the middle of this, saying, well, we don't think there should be any checks at all. We think there should be mutual recognition of goods between the UK and the EU. There should only be checks on goods that we know are going to the Irish Republic. And a whole load of other issues on VAT, on medicines. They want the ECJ to be taken out of the equation completely. I mean, stuff that is just
all
never
non-starters.
Non-starters,
absolutely.
I mean, these are ideas that the UK have been pushing in negotiation for, you know, the best part of 2 or 3 years, and it has always been rejected. And now they're saying, well, we're putting it on the table again. So, I mean, the EU deliberately had a very low-key response to the command paper, which was on the 22nd of July. Because they just, you know, I think the big question in the EU's mind is, like, David Frost must know, and Boris Johnson must know, that the EU's never going to accept this. They're not going to renegotiate the protocol. So what's their game plan? You know, is it just like ask for €100, and if you get 20, then it's better than 5? You know, but you know, the potential for the UK to engage in bad faith and to disrupt and antagonize and have a confrontational approach, you know, is significant, and the EU knows that. So, you know, we could get into a situation where if the UK simply doesn't apply the protocol, then the EU has to then get into the whole realm of dispute resolution, arbitration, and if the arbitration decrees that the EU is right and the UK is wrong, then the UK has to abide. They have to apply the protocol. If they don't apply the protocol after a certain period of time, the EU has the right to impose sanctions. What kind of sanctions? Trade sanctions. I mean, would they hit the car sector? But then that starts to divide the EU, because there's always going to be some countries in the EU that will suffer as a result of trade sanctions. So I mean, that could be the long-term strategy that the UK is pursuing, but we just don't know. But you know, it's just like, from the moment the protocol was negotiated and agreed in October 2019 until the present day, the UK has taken a confrontational approach to it, with the exception of December last year, when Michael Gove and Maros Šefčovič agreed a series of flexibilities that both sides would abide by. So, you know, the recipe is there for just more conflict, more accusations of bad faith, more instability. So, stay tuned.
Look, one final observation from me. I'm just thinking back to the days when Boris Johnson and some of his supporters talked about Brexit, described it as an oven-ready deal. And these days, that's the only thing that isn't going ping, if you ask me, you know. So, look, thank you very much for your attendance, for adhering to all the protocols that have been put in place here to keep us safe. Thanks for your interest, thanks for your questions, and most of all, thanks to Tony Connelly, RT's Europe editor, for an amazing insight into what's happening. Tony, thanks a million.